She wasn't the first woman the king ever loved, but she was the first woman who made him willing to dismantle an entire religious empire just to have her. She never ruled from the throne like a queen, but she gave birth to someone who did. Someone who brought glory to England and ushered in what would later be known as its golden age, the Elizabethan era. And she didn't die from illness, nor fall in battle. She died for love, for ambition, and for daring to defy the things women of her time were never allowed to challenge.
And may you bear a new son of the king's blood.
Her name was Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, and the woman who shook all of Europe. From a mere lady-in-waiting, she rose to the heart of the court, disrupted the monarchy, and ultimately lost her head on a cold wooden scaffold. But her death was only the beginning of a legend. In today's video, we'll uncover the most dramatic truths about Anne Boleyn's life secrets buried beneath powder and crowns, the shadowy power games of the Tudor court, and the reasons why she has been both worshipped and condemned for centuries after her fall. If you think you already know Anne Boleyn, think again. Because what you're about to hear might completely change the way you see the woman who turned a kingdom upside down.
Bring up the bodies. 1536. Anne Boleyn is arrested.
Born in the late 15th century, Anne Boleyn was not a princess. She had no royal blood, was not raised in luxury, and was never destined to become a queen. She was merely the daughter of a middle-ranking nobleman, Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious man willing to place his daughter in any court, so long as it brought him power. Anne was sent to continental Europe at a very young age. She learned to speak French like a native, studied dance, music, philosophy, and most importantly, the art of negotiation within royal courts. No one could have guessed that those quiet years in France would become the foundation for a woman who would one day captivate the entire Tudor dynasty. By the time she returned to England, Anne was no longer a simple girl. She was sharp, intelligent, and carried a presence that people couldn't look away from. Henry VIII, who was already married to Catherine of Aragon, became so enchanted by her that he seemed to lose all reason. He didn't just pursue Anne as a lover, he decided to divorce Catherine, something that had never been done before in the history of the English monarchy. But divorce was not so simple. The Roman Catholic Church forbade it entirely. To marry Anne, Henry made an unthinkable choice. He severed ties with the Vatican, established the Church of England, and made himself its supreme head. A 1,000-year-old religious empire was torn apart, all for one woman. And at last, Anne became queen. But power did not come with glory. Anne's throne was built on the ashes of controversy, opposition, and deep resentment. She never won over the people, many still loyal to Catherine. The nobility saw her as arrogant, foreign, and the instigator who drove the king into rebellion. Even during her pregnancy, Anne lived in fear. Henry wanted a son, an heir to the throne, but she gave birth to a girl, a fragile, tiny child who would one day become Elizabeth I, the greatest queen in England's history. Tensions in the court grew day by day. Henry grew disinterested. Anne became controlling, anxious, and insecure. She ordered her allies to spy on the king. At times, she even instructed those close to her to pose as Henry's mistresses, simply to prevent him from falling into the hands of her political enemies. But what was bound to happen, happened. When Henry finally turned his back on her, a series of charges were fabricated: adultery, incest, treason. There was no evidence, nor fair trial. Within days, she was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and sentenced to death. History often tells us that the king grew tired of Anne Boleyn because she failed to produce a male heir, but the truth behind her downfall was far more complex. Everything began to shift shortly after what seemed like a minor incident, the fateful horseback accident of 1536. Henry VIII, then in his middle years, suffered a serious injury during a tournament. He was unconscious for 2 hours. No one was certain whether the king would survive. The news shook the entire royal court. And in that moment, with death hovering near,
Queen of England upon earth will today become a queen in heaven.
Henry is believed to have undergone a profound psychological change. He became erratic, suspicious, and quick to anger. According to some historians, the head injury from that fall may have affected the area of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and mental stability. This, they argue, could explain the sudden cruelty and unchecked volatility that defined Henry's later years, beginning immediately after that accident. But the shift in psychology was only part of the story. At that time, Anne Boleyn was pregnant with her third child. Henry still hadn't gotten the male heir he so desperately desired. The child was miscarried, not long after the king regained consciousness. The disappointment pushed him further away from the woman he had once shattered a church for. And in that fragile window of time, another woman entered the king's gaze. Her name was Jane Seymour, a quiet, gentle lady-in-waiting, not as sharp or defiant as Anne, but also lacking the kind of threatening brilliance that made men uneasy. Jane was, in the eyes of the conservative court, the image of the ideal woman. Parpen, and from the shadows, a scheme began to take shape. Several court records suggest that some of the king's closest advisors, most notably Thomas Cromwell, had begun planning Anne's removal. Why? Because she was too influential, too intelligent, too difficult to control. Jane, naive, pliable, would make a far better pawn for political power. Cromwell, once Anne's staunch ally, began gathering evidence and even fabricating allegations of adultery, incest, and treason. He manipulated the king's growing paranoia, exhaustion, and instability to turn baseless whispers into a death sentence. One of the individuals coerced into testifying against Anne was her own brother, George Boleyn, and once family bonds were broken, Henry needed no further persuasion to abandon her. The cruelest irony of all? The very man who had torn down the Vatican to marry Anne now let her die without a single word in her defense. No fair trial, no solid proof, just a sentence written in the shadows. And so, it ended. One fall from a horse, one unborn child, one glance, redirected toward someone new, and a chorus of whispers behind palace walls, weaving a death that had nothing to do with failure.
Put yourself in his way.
Yes, Your Majesty.
and everything to do with difference. Anne wasn't destroyed because she was weak. She was destroyed because she was too different. A woman who dared to love, and dared to want more than love. But if death had been the end, Anne Boleyn would never have become a legend. Because the moment she fell, the rumors began to rise. Not in the official chronicles, but in the whispered halls of the Tower of London, in the journals of servants, in the hazy memories of guards, and in folk tales that would echo for centuries. They said Anne had 6 fingers, a mark of a witch, that her body was covered in dark moles, the eyes of the devil beneath the skin, that the final look she gave her executioner was not fear, but a curse that could never be undone. A century later, the poet Thomas Wyatt, who once loved Anne from afar, refuted these claims. He described her as a woman with slender hands, fair skin, and only a small nail protruding like a bud, hardly a 6th finger. But by then, the damage was done. The story of the headless witch queen had already spread across England. Some guards swore they heard light footsteps echoing at midnight from the cell where Anne was once held. The door had long been sealed. Yet, candlelight sometimes flickered in the darkness. Even when no flame was lit, the sound of silk brushing across stone, the faint breath of something, or someone, in the night, at Hever Castle, where she grew up. Many claimed to have seen a white, headless figure gliding silently down the halls. A 19th century visitor insisted they captured a photo of a pale hand suspended in midair. Ghostly and without fingerprints, the image was reportedly stored away in a museum archive, never released to the public. An even stranger tale emerged in 1540. Just 4 years after her death, a noblewoman named Lady Cecily Ward, while touring the Tower of London, suddenly collapsed as she passed the old scaffold site. When she regained consciousness, she claimed to have seen a woman kneeling on the ground, her head already gone, and yet still speaking to the earth. Later, in her chambers, she sketched the figure, and what chilled everyone present, the face she drew was Anne Boleyn's of Beau. They say Anne never left, not because she wasn't at peace, but because something was never made right. Monks at a monastery in Bruges once preserved a manuscript titled La tête qui me parle, the head that speaks to me. Hastode. It told of a man who had executed a queen, only to hear her voice each night thereafter, not full of pain or blame, but softly repeating the same words, "Do not let me be forgotten." 2. Perhaps that is why she lingers, not for revenge, but to preserve the final memory of a woman who dared to challenge monarchy, religion, and fate itself. A woman who refused to disappear. Less than 3 years after her death, Henry VIII married 3 more women, but only Jane Seymour bore him a son, Edward VI, and she died shortly after giving birth. When Edward died young, the English throne fell into a succession crisis, and in the end, the daughter who had been most scorned, declared illegitimate, and cast aside from the royal line, ascended the throne. Elizabeth I, the only daughter of Anne Boleyn, became queen, and she didn't just reign. She ruled. Elizabeth never married. She never shared her crown. She never allowed any man to dictate her destiny. She restored religious peace, expanded England's influence across the globe, and ushered in an era so brilliant that history would name it after her. The Elizabethan era, throughout her 44-year reign. Elizabeth rarely spoke of her mother publicly, but the traces of Anne, erased from court records, silenced in portraits, still lingered. Subtly woven into every move Elizabeth made, she adopted the motto, Semper Eadem, always the same, once used by Anne Boleyn as queen. She wore a gold ring, and inside it were two tiny portraits, one of herself and one of Anne. No public proclamation, no dramatic rehabilitation, just a silent gaze from the daughter, enough to force history to look again at Anne and see her differently. Anne Boleyn never wore the crown of a reigning queen, but she gave birth to one, a queen who would reshape a nation and prove that Anne's blood had not been spilled in vain. And perhaps, if Anne's spirit still lingers somewhere in the Tower of London, amid the whispers and shadows, what brings her peace is not vindication, but truth. She planted a seed, and that seed became a crown. Perhaps Anne Boleyn was never truly allowed to live as herself. In life, she was labeled a witch, a séductrice, an ambitious woman who tore apart a church. In death, she was called a traitor, a disgrace, a stain on the court. But history, like all honest rivers, does not stop at judgment. It digs deeper, turns over the stones, and casts light on corners long buried by power and prejudice. Today, when we look back at Anne Boleyn, we no longer see a criminal. We see a woman ahead of her time, a woman who dared to love, dared to dream, dared to fight, and paid with her head. But the legacy she left behind, through blood, through tears, through quiet defiance, became one of the most brilliant chapters in England's history. You think you already know Anne Boleyn? Think again. Because sometimes, the ones who are condemned are the only ones who truly dared to live. If what you've just heard stirred something in you, made you question the stories we've been told, then click subscribe. Turn on the notification bell, and walk with us, because in every video, you'll not only see the past, you'll see the present in a completely different light. Thank you for watching.